When you're thinking of pacing, you now have all these units designed. At most, you might have 17 units because there were 17 different reading standards that we looked at. Remember that there were 9 we were looking at for informational text and 8 that we were looking at for literature. So what we want to do is, whether you had 17 or group some together, so maybe you have less, and that's fine as well, how are you going to pace these throughout your year? There's some issues that you want to consider when you're doing pacing. Part of it is the depth and complexity of the unit. As you look at some of the standards, some of them are much easier to grasp for the students, especially when you're doing things like sequence of events and those type of skills. Students naturally gravitate to that a lot quicker than some of the ones that have a lot of deeper analysis. And so you'll need to take that into consideration when you're providing pacing for that unit. Another piece is you need to think about the specific students within your school. Your pacing may look different year to year depending on who's in your classroom that year. So thinking about the prior knowledge of those students or ways that they have strengths or areas for improvement, that might change how that pacing is going to flow and which units need to have more time than others. Another piece is the beauty of Catholic schools, our interesting calendars. You have odd calendar times of the year. For example, standardized testing week. Some people absolutely do ELA during standardized testing, and some people don't touch it at all. So you want to take that into consideration when you're through pacing because you don't want to plan to have instruction that week if it's not actually going to take place. The first week of school is similar. Some people just do assessments that first week or procedural things that week. So you need to be sure you're taking that into account so that you have an honest look at your pacing guide. The Christmas program or break times are other things to look at. The last thing to consider is you do not need a unit to end perfectly at the end of a quarter or a trimester. It is fine for it to carry over to the next one. It just means that summative assessment grade wouldn't be on that report card, and that's fine. So don't feel constrained by the quarter or trimester when you're doing pacing. However, if it's the end of the year, it does need to be done. Or if it's before a long break, it's advisable to end that unit before the break. So if you're looking at Christmas, if you're looking at Easter, it tends to be better for students to end it because accessing that prior knowledge and pulling it all back can lose a lot of instruction time when you come back from that break. So there's a pacing template that I'm going to pass out now that has 3 different components to it. You're going to get 2 sheets. So I'm going to pass it the same way, take one from the first, one from the second. One is an example if you had quarters, the other is an example if you have trimesters. They're blank right now, but I'm going to show you how you would fill these in for your own school. As these come around, there are 3 components that you're looking to fill out for each quarter or trimester. The first component is labeled, or column is labeled weeks. What that intends you to do is to write the month and day that each week begins in that quarter or trimester. So if it were August 7th, and then August 14th, and then August 21st, all you're doing is writing the month and the day that begins that week. I always find it very interesting when I help schools do this because it really lets you know whether you have decided to have even quarter and trimesters or very oddly lengthened ones. The second column in each of those quarter or trimesters says days. What this means is you need to write the number of instructional days you have that week for that subject. So if you teach ELA every day like most schools do, most of those weeks are going to say 5. However, you need to take into account, is it a 4-day week? Is it Thanksgiving week? Is it a week when you're going to have a specific program or feast day at your school that will cause instruction for ELA not to take place? You want to be honest about the number of actual instructional days for that subject. Like I said again, ELA tends to be 5. It's quicker to fill out. If you're doing science or social studies in the lower grades, a lot of times teachers may only teach those 2 or 3. And so again, that's really important to take into account because it lets you think about the length of time units will take to cover. The third column in each of those quarter or trimesters says unit. Here's where you're just writing the unit theme or the name of that unit. So if you were to fill it out, here's an example of what it might look like. This is an example of looking at quarters. It's not as clear as it could be. For the week, you have the beginning dates for each of those weeks. So August 8, 15, 22, 29, September 5th, all the way down for each one. For the second, you can see whether that day, how many instructional days you would have for ELA. In this school, most often you're seeing 5, but every now and then there's a spattering of 4 or 3, depending on what is happening in that school's calendar. Then the last thing you do is say, how am I going to space out each of my units? So I write, if you can see in the top one, there's nothing planned for that first week because this is a school that does assessments and procedures the first week of school. So they don't plan to start the first week, they block that out. They plan to start the second week. They put the title of the unit, in this case it was parts of a book, and then they draw an arrow for how many weeks approximately they plan that unit to take. They go through all the other units, spacing them so that they can fit throughout the year with an arrow saying approximately how long. Most of the units, as this teacher decided to do, are planned to take about 2 to 3 weeks. 2 to 4 weeks is a pretty average unit length if you're thinking about what students can combine together. So what you want to do at the beginning of the year, or if you're thinking about implementing your reading maybe 4th quarter just to try a couple units, you would just space out a couple in the 4th quarter this year if you wanted to kind of experiment with it. But for next year, you want to lay out what a solid year would look like. Now, this is the ideal. Then comes our reality. If you are just the on top of it teacher, you hit this ideal every time, or you're even ahead of the game. I haven't met you yet. If you're like most people, they get to a certain stopping point, they reflect, and they say, I've fallen behind. Here's what I recommend doing within a school. You want to update this guide at the end of every quarter or trimester to reflect the reality of what is actually taking place. Because here's what you have to remember. It's okay to acknowledge that you got a little behind, but you still have a professional responsibility to ensure that every child in that classroom had an opportunity to master every standard at that grade level. So that means you need to modify and adjust how the rest of the year is going to look to still give them that opportunity. So that may make things that you thought you'd have more time for have to be crunched into a smaller. So this allows you at the end of every quarter or trimester, whatever your system might be, to be able to reflect and adjust that schedule so that you're still able to do it before the end of the school year.